Okay, so as usual, we'll do this lecture in English. It's quite different than the previous lectures. And today the topic is SWOT analysis. This is a tool that somebody invented, used a lot in business schools. In business schools, the people who learn it are people who become middle managers in companies. Right? So when they look at their competition, it's usually other big companies and they know their business and so on. In the case of startups, it's a little different because especially if you look at a beachhead that's underserved or unserved, the competition may not be a company. The competition may be a habit or something like that. So I will give an example of, I'll talk a bit about the four quadrants, but give an example of a company that I've talked a lot about, which is Netflix. Sort of looking back 10 years or so, see where were they and what might have been their SWOT analysis. So just to remind you, we started with purpose, disruption, beachhead, and looking at Netflix, let's say around 2007, 2008, their purpose was to become the best global entertainment service. So if you go to Netflix or their website, that's still pretty much the same. The disruption that they started with in the late 90s was that they're riding the web adoption curve. So the people who will use Netflix are not just people who like movies, they're people who are using the web, and they can go on the web to the Netflix site and choose the movies that they want through various categories. In the beginning there were, so if you think I think 97 or something like that, 96, which one of you was using the web in 96, 97? Anybody here? World Wide Web? Okay. But not everybody. So the initial population was actually quite small, but growing very, very, very fast. And that's what they were banking on. And the second thing was to use a very simple model, which is very common in the US, the mail order subscription, or mail order in general. So, you know, these days right now, Sears is actually going under. Sears was the first big catalog mail order company in the US. It started more than 150 years ago. They had a huge catalog, it was like this. And if you lived in some little village in Texas or something like that, you could order shoes, a sewing machine, a Colt revolver, anything you wanted from Sears. They didn't yet have stores. Then they moved to have stores, but you know, there are many mail order services in America because it's a very big, big country, not like Israel where you can, anyone can go to a store. So mail order subscription is you subscribe to a certain number of movies that you can see, and you can have 5 movies or 8 movies, and it's not as good as going to a Blockbuster store because now it's 9 o'clock in the evening and you really want to make some popcorn and see a movie. You go to Netflix. In those days, you order a movie, it gets you 2 days, 3 days from now. So you can't watch movies on an impulse. But on the other hand, you can watch a movie every day and you have no late fees and nobody cares about that. So that's a big improvement on that side. And the beachhead was web users with DVD player. And I actually looked at their history and I have to say that I misled you. I stated the wrong fact. So in fact, I think 2003 or something like that, there were not enough, this wave did not grow fast enough. And Netflix didn't see how they can exist or raise enough money. So they went to Blockbuster and asked them to buy them. Now, I said $1 million, I was wrong. $50 million, 50. Blockbuster said no. So they had no choice but to raise money and persist, and a year later it happened. So that's the purpose, the disruption and the beachhead of Netflix, and we'll look now at the SWOT analysis. So SWOT analysis is really very, very simple. Like everything else I talk about here, it's quite trivial, and it's just a framework of looking at the competition, looking at yourself, at your company, and creating a strategy from this kind of analysis. So there are positive things about your business and there are negative things. There are internal things that are inside your company, and there are external things. So what's positive and internal strengths? What are the strengths that you have? One of the basic strengths of any startup is that you have no respect for the status quo. That's a big, big difference from a big company, because a big company exists in some status quo, and it wants to retain it because it works for them. A startup always comes from having absolutely no respect for the status quo. They want to break things. What's a negative? Internally, you have weaknesses. So each one of your startups has a big weakness. You have no money. You have no staff. You may not know exactly what you want to do. These are pretty big weaknesses. But you also have other strengths. You have some intellectual property. You have deep science. You may have a patent. You have a different way of looking at things. So these cover two areas. Opportunities are things that are outside. What are opportunities? The number of users looks like it's rising, 70% per year. If you compound that, that's an amazing thing to write. That's an opportunity. Moore's law was an opportunity for anyone doing anything with semiconductors. Right? So the capacity or price or power of the microprocessor grows by a factor of 2, doubles every 18 months. That's an opportunity that you can bank on. The Chinese population is becoming urban at a fast rate. That's an opportunity. If you're developing some kind of a drug or pharmaceutical device, obesity is an epidemic in the United States. More and more people who are extremely overweight and are very susceptible to having diabetes and heart diseases and so on. What a blessing. That's an opportunity. You can serve them. And what are threats? So the threat you have is another company like you, some small startup in some other place may come up with a better solution. You don't even know about them. So that's a threat. By the way, a weakness could be your team. The team may not be strong enough, the team may break. That's a weakness. And if you're just 3 people starting a company, that's a big weakness, because if one leaves, you're nowhere already. You break up. So threats are all external things, and now I'll take an example of all of these from Netflix. So Netflix's challenge was to move from sending envelopes to doing online streaming. Okay, that was a challenge for them, because now they had to change to create a new business. So initially, Netflix was competing with Blockbuster. At this point, Blockbuster was still kind of alive. All kinds of investors bought them every time. They bought them at a lower price, until the price was so low that they filed for bankruptcy. But at this point, they could see that the opportunity with the cost of streaming dropping very, very fast, that they could probably move into streaming faster and sooner than they expected to previously. So what were the strengths? One strength was they had a subscription model. Nobody else had a subscription model, meaning you pay us $8 a month and you can see 5 movies, or you can get to your home by mail 5 movies. That was a unique thing. They already had millions of customers in the US. They were starting to look at other markets, but they were not there yet. And remember, they're sending millions of red envelopes with DVDs. That's what they were doing. They had big logistics centers all over the United States, and there were many people there, getting the envelopes, scanning them, opening them, throwing the DVD, it went to the right place, everything was stocked, a little bit of robotics, but quite labor intensive. They had a huge categories database. They were really, really smart. So when you go to a video store like a Blockbuster, there is no one there who really knows you and can recommend to you what people like you may want to watch. Right? So you go and you pay Peter Pan and this and that, and you go to the clerk and you ask them, so you got a new movie, and they give you some thriller or something, you know, and you're not interested maybe in that category. They created, I think around 2010, I looked at that something like 50,000 categories. They had a whole team creating categories, just almost outsourcing. The category for a composer, all the things you see in the credits in the movie, like who is the lead actor, lead actress, producer, composer, and so on. But then they had other things, all kinds of, you know, sad movie, happy movie, a boring movie, a movie that's picking up, you know, suspense, kind of funny, but tens of thousands of categories.
How they did it back then?
Excuse me?
How they managed to build such a big database?
They hired people, and they told them, tag these movies. You see a movie, not the whole movie. You see, you run through a movie really, really fast, and you tag it. And you can, if there are tags that exist, great. If not, just make them up. Make up tags. They just made up tens of thousands of tags. A lot of people. They had a huge team. Wow. And that's what they were doing. So now, at that time, I started getting some really interesting recommendations. I think I said it before. I started getting recommendations for a strong female lead. So I'm just watching movies with my family, and we're getting strong female leads. So the recommendations were strong female lead at some point. And then there were many other, and tags would all of a sudden appear. And actually, it wasn't that great. It didn't work very well. But it was a very, very powerful thing to have. They had early adopter devotees. So part of the population, some people are early adopters of technology. Like I'm not, I'm a late adopter. But early adopters, they'll buy the first iPhone. They will stand outside the store. They'll buy a new Gizmo. They're the first people who buy Alexa. It's always the same people. So these are people that you can count on them to adopt the next new thing that that you will bring into the market. It's more of it's a psychological attribute. Okay? And the other strength was they were willing to ignore the status quo. They don't care. And actually, they were willing to cannibalize themselves. That's a very strong thing. They invested already hundreds of millions of dollars in these logistics centers and in the stock of movies that they had. So these were the strength. They had millions of DVDs all across the US in different fulfillment centers, logistics centers, had many, many employees. It was like Amazon, but only for DVDs. And they knew that when they move to the streaming model, they will have to write off their investment in the DVD business. The opportunities was to have mass market adoption, right? Because if you can go to everyone that had a TV, all of a sudden you have a huge market. You don't need a DVD player. You can actually get mass market adoption for seeing a movie just right now. So it could really be an amazing thing. Online costs were declining, and the opportunity was to actually go global. So at that point, it was only in the US. They did not ship DVDs outside the US because in the US they got the subsidy. You know, the US Post Service is losing money, meaning the government is actually subsidizing your logistics. Moving to other countries makes it prohibitive. You know, and it's different in every country. They didn't want to do that. So, and the US population is what, 320 million people out of 7.5 billion people. Obviously, it's a tiny, it's 5% of the world population. They had the opportunity to actually reach, you know, the other 95%. So what were the weaknesses? The weakness in going to online streaming is that now you have to get copyrights for these movies. Okay, so in the previous model, in the envelope model, they could just go and buy many DVDs, 1,000 DVDs of the same title, of the same movie, put them in their places and rent them out. That was fine. But when you're streaming, these kinds of rules on renting don't apply. You're not renting. You're actually distributing content in other ways. And for the same movie, there could be different owners in different countries. There are different companies that bought the copyright for that movie. Okay, so it's not owned by just one company worldwide. Usually the producers who make the movie sell the rights to that in different countries. So it's a highly fragmented market for the copyrights, and it's a big problem of how to manage it. That's a big weakness. Which, by the way, I think Blockbuster didn't have, because they could just buy the DVDs and put them in the store. The brand was not known. When I got back to Israel in 2012, and I told people about Netflix, most people I talked to never heard of Netflix. Nobody knew about Netflix in Israel, and nobody knew about Netflix in other places. Yeah.
But this is also, I think, because online streaming was just still rising.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just maybe in the last 2 years.
No, but
You
even
see more.
But on the brand, nobody knew Netflix, and when I tell people that Netflix started with red envelopes, people say, really? Maybe they go and look in the web to see if it's true. Nobody in other countries, in Canada, people know about them. In Brazil, I think they started with envelopes, but in most other markets, nobody knew about Netflix. And now you want to go global, that's the opportunity, but you're really weak because nobody knows your brand. And creating a global brand is really, really expensive. And they were also lacking content in global markets. So if you come to Israel and you want to have a lot of people watching it, you probably need to have Israeli movies. But they never bought Israeli movies in the US because the population is not large enough. By the way, you also need to have subtitles. And that's a big effort to create subtitles in many different languages. And the recommendation engine was really poor. So the recommendations that you got were not very good. And in fact, I'm trying to remember, I think it was about 2010. I actually had discussions, I think in 2008, with the VP R&D at Netflix. There was some company here that had algorithms which I thought might be better at recommendations, and they really sucked. I mean, you get all kinds of recommendations, and you try the movie, you order it, and you're still getting an envelope, and the movie doesn't really fit, and you're pissed off because you wanted to see a movie tonight, and this movie really sucks. What they did, I think it was in 2010 or 11, they announced the Netflix price, I think it was called, and they put all the data, all the categories data, and all the data of which customer ordered what movie, and gender, and zip code, I think. They put it out in the public, and they said, here are the results, our results of recommendations for each one of these people. Here is how people responded. This is before streaming. $1 million prize for whoever could do the recommendations 10% better than what we're doing. And many research organizations and individuals competed for that, and nobody succeeded. And then they decided to extend it one more year, and 3 teams actually came together. One team from IBM in Haifa, here in Israel, another guy from England, and I forget who the third team was. And they cracked it. They were able to be 12% better. But still, it's not good enough, because if you give bad recommendations to people, they give up on the service. The quality of the service is not good enough. So these were really major problems, major weaknesses that they had, and were impossible for them to fix for very difficult to fix. And then there were threats. So these threats were already starting. You could see that there were adjacent movers. So those other companies who were selling something to people or providing an experience to a market that overlaps with them, which is all the web users, like Apple and Amazon and Google, were companies that were starting to make moves into this world. Google's move was YouTube, and they didn't have to pay for the content, and the content has no copyright. It's a different kind of movie, but still, it seemed like it could become a threat. Amazon was already renting DVDs like Amazon through the web, and definitely they have very powerful machine learning abilities for recommendations. They could do recommendations in books, they could do it here as well. And Apple was very, very big in renting music. Even before the Apple Music service started, they had iTunes, so it was very much possible for Apple to get into this business. So that was a big threat, because these are huge companies and Netflix is a tiny company at that point compared to them. There was a threat of net unneutrality. What does that mean? That means maybe not in the US, but in other countries, companies like the TV networks and the cable networks, who some of them are also internet service providers, could decide to give a better service to their own content and maybe block other people's content. And actually in the US there was a net neutrality law. And when here President Trump got in, that law was repealed. So President Trump gave the ability to big monoliths, to monopolies to actually block other companies from providing the same great service in content on the web, on the net. And this is what's happening today. And in a more severe way, it's happening in China, of course, because the Chinese government can block anyone if they wish to, and they do block a lot. Anyone here has been to China other than you? So I was in China in 1982, and then again a couple of years, last year, I was in Guangzhou, and I didn't prepare so well. I came with my laptop, and no Google, no Amazon, no Facebook, no LinkedIn, no WhatsApp, maybe WhatsApp.
I think they have something like
WeChat.
WeChat.
No, WeChat, but all the services I was using, they simply don't exist in China, China is the world, and excuse me?
Workarounds for everything if you want to.
Yeah, there is a workaround. You can have a VPN, you could do all kinds of things like that, but I had to download WeChat. To use WeChat, you have to have a Chinese phone number. And I didn't have a Chinese phone number. So I went in Starbucks, and the guy at Starbucks was willing to authorize it with his phone number. It probably worked for the Chinese intelligence service. And the other thing was, here you have to license the content from people who own it in a geographic territory. Let's say in Israel or in India or in the US. You can't just go buy DVDs and play them on the, streaming. That is against the law, against the copyright law. And some of these companies could refuse to sell your content. So what did Amazon do? So they do a few things. First of all, they tried the first year or 2 years. First of all, they started with free streaming. So I remember in, I think around 2011, when I was living in Silicon Valley, we said free streaming, and we said great. We started seeing movies every night. The quality was not good, the service was not great, but we were guinea pigs. They were just doing a big experiment to see how people use it and if it's any good. So we were very happy using it, and we started ordering less titles, less DVDs. It's all data, right? We got all that data from initially hundreds of thousands and then maybe a few millions of people who were willing, the quality sometimes too pixelated, too small, movies would get stuck, there were all kinds of problems there, but we were quite happy to be guinea pigs. The other thing they did is they paid companies like Disney and others for the content. And initially, those companies were happy to license it to them because they were sure that Netflix would fail. So why not make it, in this streaming model? So why not make some money? But 2 years later, these companies increased the prices, sometimes by a factor of 10 or even more, or just choked them, would not give them the content. And there are movies that even in the US you cannot see because the movies that HBO makes, they don't necessarily license it to Netflix. Some of the studio or some networks got together and there's a service called Hulu. Hulu makes movies. You cannot see these movies on Netflix because they're a competitor, and so on. Another thing they did is they decided to split the company into two companies. One would do the streaming and one would do the DVD, and they would charge you twice if you had both. The customers were really pissed off, and the stock, the share price of Netflix went down like 30% in 1 day or something like that. And the CEO got on stage and said, I did this stupid thing, I'm really sorry, we're going to keep it together. So they tried a few things, but I think in the end, they said, okay, one thing that we can do that other companies cannot do, we can actually tailor the titles. We can create movies that appeal to a very large audience. How can we do that? We don't know what the plot should be, but we know all the qualifiers. And I think I recounted the story of House of Cards. They knew that there was a very big market for a suspense movie that's happening in Washington, D.C. It involves politicians. It involves the White House. It has Kevin Spacey as the lead actor and Robin Wright as the lead actress. They knew who the producer should be, and they knew who the director should be, and they knew who should compose the music, and they had no idea what the plot would be, and they didn't care. And they actually gave this list to the screenwriter, and the screenwriter created the movie, the pilot, and that was House of Cards. Nobody else could do that because no one else had all these categories and all that data. So this was, House of Cards was the first data-produced series. Nobody else did that before. Another thing they could do was preempt the other players. Preempt means start first. So the big companies didn't want to take a big risk on creating a big streaming service. And that gave some time to Netflix to say, okay, we're going to take a risk. We're just going to do it first in the US, then in Brazil, then in some other countries. And they also understood that with the volume of business that we're doing, at some points, even today, Netflix accounts for about 20% of all the internet traffic in peak times in the evenings. That it was not a smart thing for them to host it on their own servers. Because until then, they developed the software, they put it on their own servers, and they shifted to Amazon Web Services on the Amazon cloud. And Amazon is competing with them. So this company is actually putting itself in Amazon. Not only that, they took a lot of the software and algorithms that they created and they put them out in the public domain. They made them open source because that way other people could improve on these algorithms. And they took a very conscious decision that this will kill the DVD envelope business. And they just went and did that. In this, maybe they sat together in a conference room, the whole board, and had a SWOT analysis. Maybe they didn't, but they had some kind of process like that of thinking, because this is the future of the company. If they mis-executed in this, there would be no more Netflix. Somebody else would preempt them, somebody else would create that content, and they would be gone. And later, they had some improvements. So with House of Cards, they said, what else can we do? Because now they have a new set of competitors. The competitor is not Blockbuster. The competitor are the TV networks, the cable networks, and Hollywood. This is big competition. What can we do different? Well, we we rent these movies in a subscription model, right? You can watch as many movies as you want for the monthly rate. And we don't have advertising revenue. So we don't care. You want to see the whole series, you want to see 24 hours and see, the whole season, go ahead, be our guest. So binging was invented by Netflix, which really gave them a very powerful advantage over the TV networks, and creating their own series gave them a very strong advantage over standard content out there. Now today the envelope business may exist, I have no idea, but if it exists, it's really, really small. So they ran this thing in the US for I think about 3 or 4 years. And then I think a year ago or a year and a half ago, they decided to go global. And they didn't do it in one country or another country. They opened up Netflix in one day, in 1 hour, to 130 countries. They went global in a huge way. And that's why you can see Netflix in Israel, but you cannot see all the movies that you can see in the US. It's very different. So now when you think about your business, you can also do the same kind of analysis, even though your business doesn't really exist. Right? So we're thinking now that we're doing something in the energy for bicycles business. Whether your strength, well, you have a certain substance, right, that you can create something that is cheaper, better, more appropriate, has better energy availability, and you can charge it faster than lithium ion, all kinds of other benefits. And if you look at the, let's say, bicycle rental companies like Ofo, Mobike, that's not their core. They don't know how to do that stuff. So you already have an advantage. On the other hand, you have 0 bicycles out there using your thing. Right? There are opportunities that you can realize here in terms of who would want this, what can grow in a really fast way. And there are also threats, because what you're doing here, another company may be doing in Berkeley or somewhere else, or because of the problems with these rental models, like Ofo, who was here on campus, and left the campus and left Israel. Anyway, there's one Ofo bicycle hanging in the smart cities area near engineering. We put it on the wall, it looks like a sculpture, it's really cool. I think that's the last Ofo in Israel. So there are regulatory issues, right? Cities are struggling with all these bikes that are all around, and that's a threat because some city could block that. But for any idea that you have here, for any problem that you want to solve for any target market, you can run the SWOT analysis. If you're going into an unserved market, try to think of one. So let's say, I'm not sure, okay. So let's say you have a new energy device, let's say some new version of a solar panel, and you want to put it in villages in India. And in those villages, they actually don't even have electricity. They go out to the fields and they collect cow dung, bullshit in other words, and they use that for cooking and maybe for lighting. So your competition, if you're coming with these solar panels, it's not other companies that have solar panels. Your competition is cow shit. Okay? Your competition is the fact that today the way people cook or the way people produce energy is using, bovine feces. That's your competition. Or the competition may be that people with some kind of disease or some kind of ailment, they don't do anything. Apathy may be your competition. So don't look necessarily at companies. And also another problem that I see a lot with startups, especially in Israel, when they look at competition, they look at all the other startups in their domain, and they analyze competition according to they see the other startups. And I was asking, so what market share does that other startup have? Well, zero. It's not a competitor. Just ignore other startups. Don't even look at other startups. Definitely don't look at other startups in your field, because you'll start thinking like them and copying them, and you lose your originality and your creativity. Startups who have zero market share do not count as competition. They don't exist. You know nothing about them. They could go under next year. The founders can quarrel with each other and break up. They simply don't exist. They're not on the map. Don't even put them on the map. They just don't exist. That already makes your job a lot easier because there are less competitors to look at. So, just finish again. We have 1 week to get your problem in place. It's really, really critical. Do some research on the web. Do whatever you need. Come and meet with me. Take a slot next week, because this is really, you know, if you can't do it next week, I think a good chance that you will miss the second part of this program, and that means you'll have to wait another 10 months or something like that before we start again. So that's it. Thank you. Questions? Sheilot?